Don't drink the lemonade. The Unlikely Life of Australia's Tom Lemonade Ley by Michael Bourke, narrated by Ken Sutcliffe. From the humblest of beginnings, Thomas John Ley rose through local, state and federal politics to set benchmarks for corruption, deception and violence that have remained unsurpassed for over 100 years. A church-going atheist, Lemonade Ley, courted the temperance movement with a campaign to ban alcohol in New South Wales, while simultaneously enjoying a bottle of wine each day in the parliamentary lunchroom. As a member of the New South Wales Progressives, he orchestrated a leadership spill to bring down the Nationalist Party, installing himself as the Minister for Public Instruction in a government that lasted just over 6 hours. In business, Ley was able to corrupt government officials, fabricate scientific reports, falsify financial records, and administer Ponzi schemes on an international scale. Even when his own son was jailed over crimes they had committed together, an unswerving self-belief, Ley kept one step ahead of the law. But it is as a murderer that Ley is best remembered. In a world gone mad, it is useful to remember that the world was once a whole lot madder. A rabbit in a hat. Like most people, Thomas John Ley was born into poverty and confusion. With limited education and opportunities for women in the late 19th century England, Tom's mother, Elizabeth, was forced to spend her days completing a never-ending series of gruelling and thankless tasks in the family home. However, Tom's father, Henry, had trained as a domestic servant and was qualified to spend his days completing a never-ending series of gruelling and thankless tasks inside somebody else's house. Unfortunately for the Leys, all of the houses surrounding theirs were full of poor people. The neighbours were perfectly capable of polishing their own silver, choosing their own wines and tucking themselves into bed at night. And so it was that, when Tom was still only a baby, Henry was forced to abandon his young family in search of wealthy people to boss him around. Within 2 years, Henry was dead in a flophouse, and Elizabeth left penniless with 4 children. But despite the deprivations of his childhood, Tom Ley would go on to become a solicitor, a government minister, and eventually a multiple murderer. There goes the neighbourhood. Elizabeth Ley arrived in Glebe in 1886 with 4 children, a dead husband, and a sack full of rats. Tom, the youngest, was only 6 years old, but would claim to be 8, something that would remain a complete lie for most of his life. Glebe had been granted to Anglican clergyman Reverend Richard Johnson by Governor Arthur Phillip at a time when he should have been checking who it actually belonged to. The term glebe is an archaic English expression for a parcel of land granted to a parish priest. Not surprisingly, there appears to be no equivalent term in the language of the Gadigal people. With few parishioners to attend to, Reverend Richard Johnson spent his days sketching potential designs for Wentworth Park Greyhound Club, which was completed in 1882 and briefly experimented with the use of monkeys as jockeys in the 1920s. Governor Phillip is best remembered as the guy that kidnapped Bennelong and then got speared whilst eating a whale in Manly. A foretelling. The fatherless son of a poor new immigrant, Tom Ley was forced into work at the tender age of 6. Wheeling a trolley full of newspapers through the cramped and crooked streets of Glebe, the young boy made a startling discovery. Not everyone was poor. In fact, some people were ridiculously not poor. At Hereford House, the grand home of Judge William Wilkinson, Tom Ley glimpsed his future. It was a future of power and privilege, of respect and influence. Not only was Wilkinson a judge, but his son was a member of the New South Wales Parliament. An unlikely friendship was struck up between the little urchin and the wealthy judge. For years to come, Ley would refer to Wilkinson as his mentor. But perhaps Ley had seen even more, for Hereford House had once been the home of prominent religious pretender, prohibitionist and murderer William Torwell. You can never have too many mentors. A boy apart from others. There are some things you can teach yourself, and there are some things that the world must teach you. Having already mastered ambition, Thomas J. Ley knew that he would also have to learn both treachery and resentment in order to succeed in politics. Where better to learn these things than at school? With 2 years of full-time work behind him, the 8-year-old enrolled at Crown Street Public School in Surrey Hills. Among his classmates was a young Victor Trumper. Already a promising cricketer, Trumper was confident, kind, and immensely popular with the other children. It was around this time that Ley developed a lifelong hatred of sport. The rough end. There are a few things less pleasant than sleeping on a bunch of pineapples. For most people, going to work is one of these things. After only 2 years at Crown Street Public, Elizabeth removed Tom and enrolled him in the School of Hard Knocks. Although the discipline was harsh and the tuition only sporadic, this new arrangement allowed the young boy to have a part-time job manning a grocery store for 16 hours a day. Elizabeth had originally purchased the shop on Abercrombie Street with a view to running the business herself. It then occurred to her that it would be much easier to have her 10-year-old son do all the work. Elizabeth had become something of an entrepreneur by this stage. Not only had she taken out a lease on the terrace next door and turned it into a boarding house, but she was also renting out beds in the family home. Wedged between the docks at Woolloomooloo, Central Railway Station, Surrey Hills was perfectly located to accommodate both drunken sailors and drunken shearers. When packing up the store of an evening, Tom would regularly receive a message, "Don't come home tonight." Climbing into bed the next night, the smell of salt and sheep, of beer and regret was unmistakable. Exile and the Kingdom. When the Board of Education told Elizabeth Ley that she couldn't have her 10-year-old son skip school to run a grocery store, the ever-resourceful mother of four hit upon a novel solution. She would sell him into slavery. Before the authorities could escort him back to school, Thomas Ley was secretly transported out of the city and into the country to work as a labourer on a dairy farm in Windsor. For the aspiring lawyer and politician, this was undeniably a setback, but the fact that he couldn't tell one end of a cow from the other, that he'd only had 2 years of schooling, a dead father, and a mother who seemed determined to profit from his exploitation, was not going to stop Tom Ley from achieving greatness. To overcome extreme hardship, one must have equally extreme determination. Delusion and luck are probably helpful too, but even more important than determination, delusion or luck is a plan. And Tom Ley was always a man with a plan. Even when he was only a boy, between milkings, Tom would teach himself shorthand with a cheap textbook and a stack of Sydney Morning Heralds. That way, should he ever get out of the mud and dung and find his way back to Sydney, he could walk right up to any solicitor and basically demand a job. Of course, he would have to shower first. A threshold is crossed. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a 17-year-old boy in possession of grandiose ambitions must be in want of a wife. Tom Ley was never all that interested in truths, but he was mad for wives. To marry the 21-year-old Louisa Vernon, he had to pretend to be 18. And while some may claim that a lie is not the best foundation upon which to build a marriage, it is, in fact, a very useful foundation upon which to build a life in both politics and crime. By a strange coincidence, the newly married couple would begin their life in crime and politics directly across the road from Hereford House, the very place where Tom's dream of a better future had begun. And who said God doesn't play dice? How many warnings must I send you? In 1917, Thomas J. Ley stood against Labor member Samuel Toombs for the New South Wales parliamentary seat of Hurstville. It was during this campaign that slanderous graffiti first appeared outside of Hurstville train station, referring to him as Lemonade Ley. It is highly likely that Ley painted the graffiti himself. It is almost certain that he came up with the nickname. It was a good way to win the votes of church-going wowsers, as it was to feed his increasing sense of paranoia. At his final campaign rally, Ley arrived in a hearse and delivered the words, "We are here to bury Labour's hopes, and we are here to entomb tombs." Politics is a funny business. The Cootamundra Incident. One of the trickiest things about keeping a fully stocked army is that all the bravest soldiers tend to die. By 1917, many Australians had started to question whether sleeping in a rat-infested trench and getting shot at by foreigners was the sort of thing they were into. The Australian government was in a bit of a pickle. It was fully committed to supporting Britain in a pointless and seemingly endless waste of human lives, but very few government members were all that keen on wasting their own lives. The trick was to get other people to do the dying. Because Australians believe in a fair go for everyone, it was decided that everyone over 21 years of age would get to have their say as to whether men between 18 and 35 could be sent to war against their will. Perhaps the reason that Tom Ley was so enthusiastic about this plan was the fact that he was now 36. Full of patriotic zeal and way too old to fight, Ley set out on a speaking tour of rural New South Wales in support of conscription. But sometimes standing up for what you believe in is not enough, especially when there are other people who believe in other things. At an anti-conscription rally in Cootamundra, Ley's constant heckling finally earned the response, "Why don't you put on the King's uniform?" So Ley punched a man with one leg. Love is in the air. Hard to believe now, but in 1921 there were far too few Australians putting in and putting out for the country. With so much dirt and so few people holding on to it, the great southern land was basically screaming terra nullius to our northern neighbours. As part of the push to populate or perish, Tom Ley visited Perth and spent a very productive week exploring all sorts of ways to make the country grow with married couple Mr. and Mrs. Bourke. At some stage, whilst Maggie Bourke and Lemonade Ley were focusing on the populate, Mr. Bourke seems to have perished in the most mysterious of circumstances. Allergic to bees, the unfortunate fellow suffered multiple stings whilst lunching at his house, leaving behind a widow, one child, and a truckload of money. Despite having a wife and children of his own, Tom Ley helped Maggie find comfort as she mourned her loss, at first in Perth and then later in Sydney. Eventually, he managed to find her a flat, conveniently just near his parliamentary office, so he could comfort her as often as he liked. A promise of lemonade for everyone. On the whole, Australian politicians are rather crap at all things bat and ball related. For every David Pocock or Nova Peris, there's 1,000 no-balling John Howards and child-tackling Scott Morrisons. But there has always been an expectation amongst all Australians that their elected representatives will at least pretend to care about sport. Pretending was one game that Tom Leigh excelled at. He pretended to be friends with former Essendon ruckman, come social justice good guy, celebrity priest Robert Hammond. He pretended to be deeply concerned about the evils of alcohol and the devastating impact that it had on the lives of the poor and vulnerable. He pretended that he had suffered the jibes and slander of electors who derided him as Lemonade Ley. And he pretended that, with the help of Canon Robert Hammond, the Association of Churches and generosity of campaign donors, that would push for a ban on alcohol. From community halls throughout the suburbs of the Sydney Town Hall, church-going teetotalers rallied to watch the footballing priest and the man they called Lemonade deliver a message of hope. But when he was re-elected and made Minister for Justice, Lemonade was not quite ready to call last drinks. The immediate referendum that he had promised was scheduled for 5 years hence, long enough to give the brewers and the hoteliers a chance to mount their own campaign, long enough to allow for a change of minister, a change of government, a change of mind, long enough to develop an extensive portfolio of hotel shares and a few extra inches around the waist. No one is safe from a monster like Leigh. Being the Minister for Justice used to be a great job for a self-righteous psychopath. Unfortunately, New South Wales no longer has a Department of Justice. We have a Department of Communities and Justice. Putting the community first, even if only in a name, would surely take the shine off the job for a man like Leigh. From a psychopath's point of view, what is worse is that they have done away with executions and put in place a whole heap of checks and balances, so it's hard to manage quite the same level of corruption and interference. Organised crime, like so many things, has been privatised. But even overseeing the execution of the mentally ill and drafting legislation for the castration of a sex offender couldn't hold Leigh's attention forever. He had dreams of being Prime Minister. Canberra was calling. Only Canberra wasn't actually Canberra yet, because it was in Melbourne. Canberra was mainly just sheep stations and building projects. And besides, the Nationalists, whom Leigh had rejoined, were headed for electoral annihilation. But if there was ever a time to jump ship, it was now. As a thank you to the people of New South Wales and a gesture of goodwill to the incoming government, Leigh arranged for the secret release of a notorious sex offender and child killer, Leonard Puddifoot. Not surprisingly, the public was outraged. Graffiti started appearing around Tom Leigh's old seat of Hurstville, warning the public no one is safe from monsters like Puddifoot and Leigh. Strangely enough, most of this graffiti was painted by Tom Leigh himself. On the 28th of May 1923, Leonard Puddifoot killed Percy Carrott in an abandoned lot in Arncliffe. In court, Puddifoot explained that he hadn't meant to kill the 5-year-old, that he was only trying to stifle the young boy's screams. Surprisingly, this defence held some sway with the judge, and Puddifoot received the remarkably short sentence of 3 years. The mysterious disappearance of Frederick MacDonald. The only thing that stood between Tom Leigh and a seat in federal parliament was his long-term friend and colleague, Frederick MacDonald. Before rock and roll, the internet and fun, young people would sometimes join the School of Arts Debating Society. It was here, as a 16-year-old, that Tom first met the 21-year-old trainee schoolteacher, Frederick MacDonald. It was a friendship that lasted almost 30 years and could have lasted even longer had Frederick been a little more willing to take bribes and a little less willing to get kidnapped and murdered. Had Frederick been willing to pull out of the 1925 federal election, had he kept his mouth shut about the bribe that Ley had offered him, had he refused to lodge a case at the Court of Disputed Returns, and had he agreed to pay Ley several £1,000s in damages, the friendship may have survived. But instead, Frederick MacDonald disappeared somewhere between Martin Place and Macquarie Street in broad daylight on the 15th of April 1925 and was never seen again. A very prickly business. Before the introduction of the Cactoblastus moth in 1925, Australia was in danger of becoming one enormous cactus garden for hardened rabbits to eat and make love in. Prickly pear was originally introduced to provide habitat for the cochineal bug, so necessary in the production of Tim Tams. But before too long, it was rendering thousands of square kilometres of grazing land unproductive and forcing many Australians to move towards a diet made up entirely of chocolate biscuits. Despite being quite partial to the occasional sweet treat, Tom Leigh saw that there was money to be made in saving our soil and promptly set up a private company called Save Our Soil Prickly Pear Poisons. As a successful businessman, solicitor and government minister, Leigh had all the connections and know-how necessary to get effective poison onto the ground. All he needed was financial backing and an effective poison. By the time Tom Leigh had sold his shares in Save Our Soils, he had convinced a legion of investors from within the world of politics, finance and the law to buy up big. Using falsified scientific studies and fake financial statements provided by his son Keith, the minister was able to turn a couple of 100 drums of bleach into a small fortune and still enjoy as many Tim Tams as he wanted. The mysterious death of Hyman Goldstein. Mystery has a way of following some people. Take, for instance, Scooby-Doo. Hyman Goldstein was another friend and colleague of Tom Leigh. He had worked at the same legal firm and was a member of the New South Wales Parliament. As a friend, Hyman was lucky enough to receive some business advice from Tom. But by the time the truth about Save Our Soil's prickly pear poisons had surfaced, Hyman was thousands of dollars out of pocket and Tom Leigh was nowhere to be found. As a man of law, Hyman had a nagging feeling that he had paid way too much money for a lie. As it turned out, the truth would prove to be far more expensive. Hyman convinced several other investors to start legal proceedings against Tom Leigh. With investigations underway, Hyman Goldstein was found dead at the bottom of a cliff near his house at Coogee Beach. Apparently, he had wandered a little too close to the edge and accidentally fallen off. The silly fellow probably didn't have his glasses on. The mysterious death of Keith Gredor. In the olden days, Newcastle was a long way from Sydney. In fact, Newcastle was so far away that people would often travel there by steamship. Following the mysterious death of Hyman Goldstein, disgruntled investors appointed Keith Gredor to lead the legal action against Tom Leigh and Save Our Soil's prickly pear poisons. As fate would have it, whilst travelling to Newcastle as part of the investigation, Keith Gredor fell off a ship and was drowned at sea. The silly fellow probably didn't have his life jacket on. Not surprisingly, the investigation against Save Our Soil's prickly pear poisons ended at exactly the same time that Keith Gredor's body hit the water. Solicitors had lost interest in even discussing the matter. The heart will go on. Sometimes everyone just needs a chance to get away from it all, particularly when you are the subject of several corporate and criminal investigations. For years, Tom Leigh had been giving to his family, to his community, to the legal system, to local, state and federal government. It was time to give back to himself. Awash with prickly pear money, and not particularly interested in legislating now that his reputation had ruled him out of the chance at a ministry, Tom Leigh decided to take a round-the-world cruise. Although he may have briefly considered taking his wife Louisa, in the end, Tom Leigh decided to take Maggie Bourke with him. The woman was just so in need of comforting. On the run in the free city of Danzig. After a brief appearance at the League of Nations, Tom Leigh disappeared for some time. It was almost as if the mystery that had been surrounding him for so long had finally swallowed him whole. Eventually, he resurfaced, somewhat bloated, in the free city of Danzig, selling entry to a major sweepstakes for the 1931 English Derby. The prize was said to be over £1 million, an inconceivably large sum of money in the years between the wars. Against all odds, Tom Leigh had finally become a sporting man. According to form, the £1 million never materialised. The winner received a paltry £4,000. A heart is hard to hold. The Second World War was good for Tom Leigh. By now he was way too old and way too fat to fight. But you are never too old to take up black marketeering. With the money that he had made through shonky gambling ventures, Tom Leigh was able to invest in shonky real estate ventures throughout London. Both his wife Louisa and Maggie Bourke were in London with him. Maggie was still in need of occasional comfort, but the 60-year-old, he began to suspect, was in need of more comfort than a busy man could provide. As busy as he was, Tom found time to stalk his mistress. You are never too old to take up stalking. Whilst Maggie was visiting her daughter's place in Wimbledon, Tom noticed her being greeted by a young man. John Moody was 30 years Maggie Bourke's junior. With the smoke still settling from the war, he had left the army and was now adjusting to civilian life and peacetime, working as a barman. John Moody was living in the same block of flats as Maggie Bourke's daughter. He met Maggie Bourke only once, on the steps outside his flat, when the landlady introduced him to her. Amateur hour at the chalk pit. In Sydney, as a solicitor and as Minister for Justice, Tom Leigh had connections to some of the city's leading criminals. In London, he had to rely on amateurs. The murder and dumping of John Moody's body in a chalk pit just outside of London was a crime of such incredible incompetence that it would almost make Tom Leigh discover his sense of shame. Within a day, the body had been found, and several unwitting accomplices were coming forward to the police with information. Within months, Tom Leigh and Lawrence Smith were convicted of murder. A short stay. Thomas John Lemonade Ley was declared insane and sent to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. To this day, he still holds the honour of being the institution's wealthiest ever inmate. Take that, Ronnie Cray. Tom Leigh died on the 24th of July, 1947, aged 66.